Robbers smashed Virgin Mary's statue for gold. The next second they were trembling. What happened in that chapel didn't just stop a crime. It shattered two men's souls and rebuilt them from the ground up. In the heart of downtown Milwaukee, where glass towers cast long shadows over crumbling neighborhoods, stood St. Michael, the Archangel Catholic Church. Built in 1894 from honey-colored limestone, its Gothic spires had once dominated the skyline, a beacon of faith in a growing industrial city. Now, surrounded by vacant lots and struggling businesses, the church felt like a relic from another age. Beautiful, sacred, but forgotten by a world that moved too fast to notice. Father Michael Kowalski had served St. Michael's for 37 years, watching the neighborhood change around him like seasons cycling through decades. The congregation that once filled every pew now scattered across perhaps a third of the sanctuary on Sunday mornings. The stained glass windows, masterpieces of colored light that had taken German craftsmen 2 years to complete, bore hairline cracks from settling foundations and the vibrations of passing traffic. The heating system wheezed through winter months, and the roof leaked in 3 places, forcing Father Michael to position buckets strategically during storms. But despite the church's struggles, one treasure remained untouched by time or financial hardship. The statue of Our Lady of Sorrows that stood in the south transept, bathed in the ethereal blue light of the largest stained glass window. The statue was remarkable not just for its beauty, but for its history. Carved in 1889 by Italian sculptor Antonio Benedetti from a single block of Carrara marble, it had been commissioned by the parish's founding families, German and Polish immigrants who had pooled their meager savings to create something worthy of their new sanctuary. Our Lady stood 5 feet tall, her hands clasped in prayer, her face tilted slightly downward in an expression of profound sorrow and infinite compassion. Her robes flowed in marble folds so realistic they seemed to move in candlelight, and her eyes, carved with extraordinary skill, appeared to weep perpetual tears of mother's love. But what made the statue legendary in the neighborhood were the crown and rose she wore. The crown, forged from 18-karat gold and embedded with genuine pearls and small diamonds, had been donated by a grateful parishioner whose son had returned safely from World War I. In her marble hands, she held a single golden rose, its petals crafted with such delicate detail that they seemed real, a gift from another family whose daughter had recovered from tuberculosis after they prayed at the statue's feet for 9 consecutive days. The crown and rose were worth more than the average person made in 2 years. But to the faithful who knelt before Our Lady of Sorrows, their value was beyond calculation. Children brought her dandelions and daisies from the nearby park. Young mothers whispered prayers for their baby's health. Elderly widows lit candles and spoke to her as if she were their own mother, sharing sorrows and fears they couldn't voice to anyone else. Father Michael often found people weeping quietly at her feet, their hands reaching out to touch the marble base, worn smooth by decades of desperate fingers. The statue didn't just decorate the church. She anchored it, providing a focal point for faith in a world that seemed increasingly faithless. It was this treasure that caught the attention of Leo Torino on a warm Sunday evening in late September. Leo sat in his rusted Chevy Impala across the street from St. Michael's, engine running, cigarette dangling from his lips as he watched the last of the evening mass congregation trickle out into the fading daylight. At 38, Leo had the weathered look of a man who had made every wrong choice available to him. His dark hair was slicked back with cheap pomade, his leather jacket cracked and stained, his eyes the cold gray of winter sky. He had spent half his adult life in various county jails and state facilities, serving time for burglary, armed robbery, and assault. To Leo, the world was divided into two categories: things that could be stolen and things that weren't worth stealing. "Look at these people," he muttered to his companion, Marco Santini, who sat nervously in the passenger seat, walking out of there like they'd just deposited their money in God's bank account. "You see how fat those collection plates were? How much cash they were stuffing in there?" Marco, 26 and perpetually anxious, shifted uncomfortably. Where Leo was all sharp angles and predatory stillness, Marco was fidgety energy and sweating palms. He had fallen into Leo's orbit, the way small objects get pulled toward larger, more destructive ones, gradually, then completely. Marco had grown up in this neighborhood, had even attended St. Michael's as a child before his family moved away. He remembered the statue, remembered his grandmother crossing herself whenever they passed it. "I don't know about this, Leo," Marco said, wiping his palms on his jeans. "It's a church, man. That's bad luck. Really bad luck." Leo laughed, a sound like gravel in a cement mixer. "Bad luck? The only bad luck is being poor, Marco, and we're about to fix that problem permanently." He pointed through the windshield at the church's entrance, where Father Michael was shaking hands with the last few parishioners. "You see that old priest? Every Sunday, he's counting money. Lots of money. Cash donations, check offerings, maybe even some jewelry thrown in for good measure. It all goes into that donation box in the back room." Marco followed Leo's gaze, but his eyes drifted to the stained glass windows glowing in the evening light. "What if someone sees us? What if, Leo interrupted. "You sound like my grandmother, always worried about sin and damnation. Look around, Marco. You see any angels flying around ready to strike us down? You see God writing our names in some cosmic bad boy book?" He took a long drag from his cigarette and blew the smoke against the windshield. "Here's what I see. I see an old building with old locks, an old priest who goes home to his little rectory every night, and a neighborhood where nobody calls the police because they're all too scared or too poor to care." Leo had been planning this job for 3 weeks, ever since he'd attended Sunday Mass, not out of any spiritual yearning, but to case the joint. He'd sat in the back pew, pretending to pray while actually cataloguing every security weakness, every valuable item, every pattern in the church's routine. The donation box was kept in the sacristy, a small room behind the altar where Father Michael counted the weekly offerings. Leo had watched him through the partially open door, seen the stacks of cash and checks, the occasional piece of jewelry donated by grateful parishioners. But the real prize, the score that would set them up for months, was the statue. "That lady with the crown," Leo said, pointing toward the church. "Our Lady of Sorrows, they call her. You know what that crown's worth, what that golden rose in her hands is worth. I had a friend of mine who knows about precious metals. Take a look through binoculars. That's real gold, Marco. Real diamonds, real pearls. We're talking about enough money to get out of this neighborhood forever." Marco's stomach churned. He had seen the statue up close as a child, had watched his grandmother light candles at its base and whisper prayers in broken Italian. The memory of those gentle marble features felt like a weight in his chest. "Can't we just take the donation money and leave the statue alone?" he asked weakly. Leo's eyes hardened. "We're not running a charity here, Marco. This is business, big business. The statue's just a piece of marble with some gold attached to it. It's not like it's actually going to feel anything when we take the crown and rose." He stubbed out his cigarette on the dashboard, leaving another burn mark among dozens of others. "Besides, we can't carry the whole thing. It probably weighs 300 pounds. So we'll just take the valuable parts, quick and clean." Over the next hour, as darkness settled over the neighborhood like a blanket, Leo outlined his plan with the methodical precision of a man who had broken into dozens of buildings. Sunday night was perfect. Father Michael would be in his rectory, probably asleep by 10 o'clock. The church's security system was ancient, probably installed sometime in the 1970s, and Leo had the tools to bypass it. They would enter through the side door near the sacristy, hit the donation box first for the cash, then move to the main sanctuary for the statue. "How exactly are we going to get the crown and rose off?" Marco asked, though he dreaded the answer. Leo patted a canvas bag in the back seat. Crowbar, hammer, chisel. The crown's probably attached with some kind of metal fastening. The rose might be glued or welded. Worst case scenario, we'll have to damage the statue a little to get the valuable parts loose. The casual way Leo talked about damaging the statue made Marco's hands shake. He thought about his grandmother, dead now for 5 years, and how she would react if she knew what he was planning. But he also thought about the $3,000 Leo had promised him as his share, enough money to pay off his debts and maybe get out of the city entirely. "And if we get caught?" Marco asked. Leo grinned, showing teeth stained by tobacco and coffee. "We won't get caught. But if we do, it's just breaking and entering. Maybe petty theft. The old priest's not going to chase us down the street. And by the time the cops show up, we'll be long gone." As they sat in the growing darkness, watching the last lights go out in the church and rectory, Leo felt the familiar rush of pre-crime adrenaline. This was what he lived for. The moment when planning turned to action, when talking became doing. He had robbed gas stations, broken into houses, stolen cars, but he had never hit a church before. The idea excited him in a way that surprised him. It felt like crossing a line that most criminals respected, violating a boundary that even the worst people usually left alone. "You ready for this, Marco?" he asked, checking his watch. 11:47 p.m. Marco swallowed hard, his mouth dry as dust. "As ready as I'm going to be." "Good, because once we walk through that door, there's no backing out. We finish what we start." Leo reached into the back seat and pulled out 2 black ski masks and a heavy canvas bag filled with tools. The crowbar clinked against the hammer, the sound somehow ominous in the quiet car. "Remember," Leo said, pulling on his mask, "we're not here to hurt anybody. We're not here to destroy anything we don't have to. We get in, we take what we came for, and we get out. 20 minutes tops." Marco pulled his own mask over his head, the wool scratchy against his face. Through the eye holes, the world looked smaller, more focused. The church across the street seemed to loom larger in the darkness, its spires pointing accusingly toward heaven. "Let's go make some money," Leo said, and opened the car door. They crossed the empty street like shadows, their footsteps muffled by the thick soles of their sneakers. The neighborhood was quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic on the freeway and the occasional bark of a dog. Most of the houses showed dark windows. The few that glowed with television light seemed a world away from the 2 figures approaching the side door of St. Michael's. Leo knelt beside the door, pulling a small flashlight from his pocket and examining the lock mechanism. It was old, just as he had expected. A simple deadbolt that had probably been installed decades ago. He withdrew a set of lock picks from his jacket, tools he had learned to use during his second stint in county jail from a professional burglar named Eddie, who specialized in old buildings. "Keep watch," he whispered to Marco, who positioned himself at the corner of the building, where he could see both the street and the rectory. The lock took Leo less than 3 minutes to defeat. The deadbolt turned with a soft click that seemed to echo in the night air like a gunshot. Both men froze, listening for any sign that they had been detected. But the neighborhood remained silent, wrapped in the deep quiet of midnight. Leo tried the door handle. It turned smoothly, and the door swung open on well-oiled hinges, revealing the darkness of the church interior. "We're in," Leo whispered, and they stepped across the threshold into the sacred space. The interior of St. Michael's at night was a landscape of shadows and silver moonlight. The stained glass windows, so brilliant during the day, now showed only as dark shapes against darker walls. The scent of incense lingered in the air, mixed with the smell of old wood and candle wax. Their footsteps, despite their efforts to move quietly, seemed to echo from the vaulted ceiling like whispered accusations. Leo swept his flashlight across the space, the beam picking out details. Rows of wooden pews stretching towards the altar, religious statues standing in shadowy alcoves, the glint of gold from the tabernacle at the front of the church. Everything was exactly as he remembered from his scouting visit, but somehow more imposing in the darkness. "Sacristy first," he whispered to Marco, pointing toward a door behind the altar. They moved through the church like intruders in a sacred dream, their flashlight beams dancing across religious artwork and carved saints. Marco found himself looking up at the crucifix hanging above the altar, its bronze surface gleaming dully in the moving light. Christ's face, captured in eternal agony, seemed to follow their movement through the sanctuary. The sacristy door was unlocked, and they slipped inside to find exactly what Leo had hoped for. A large wooden donation box sat against the far wall, its brass lock green with age, but substantial enough to require the crowbar. Leo set to work immediately, jamming the flat end of the tool under the lock mechanism and applying pressure until the wood splintered and the brass hardware popped free with a sharp crack. Inside the box were stacks of bills, mostly 10s and 20s, but enough singles and 5s to make a substantial pile. There were also checks, which Leo stuffed into his bag despite their limited usefulness, and several pieces of jewelry, a gold wedding ring donated by a widow, a pearl necklace left by a grateful mother, a silver cross engraved with a date from 1962. "Look at this," Leo whispered, holding up a handful of cash. "Must be $3,000–4,000 just in the weekly offerings." Marco, standing watch by the door, felt sweat running down his back despite the coolness of the night. "Can we go now? We got enough to—" "Not even close," Leo interrupted, stuffing the last of the money into his bag. "We haven't even touched the main prize yet." They left the sacristy and moved back into the main sanctuary, towards the south transept, where Our Lady of Sorrows waited in her alcove. Even in the darkness, the statue was magnificent. The marble seemed to glow with its own inner light, and the gold crown and rose caught their flashlight beams like captured starlight. Leo approached the statue with the reverence of a man admiring a particularly valuable piece of merchandise. He played his flashlight over every detail, examining the way the crown was attached to the marble head, studying the delicate stem of the golden rose held in the statue's praying hands. "Beautiful work," he said, almost to himself. "Whoever made this knew what they were doing." Marco hung back, unwilling to get too close. Something about the statue's face, the expression of infinite sorrow and compassion, made him deeply uncomfortable. It reminded him too much of his grandmother, of the way she had looked at him when he disappointed her with some childhood transgression. "The crown looks like it's attached with some kind of metal pins," Leo observed, running his finger along the base where the gold met the marble. "Probably drilled right into the stone. And the rose... Yeah, this is going to require some force." He set down his flashlight and pulled the crowbar from his bag, testing its weight in his hands. "I'll try to be surgical about this, but if the attachments are too strong, I might have to damage the statue a little to get the valuables loose." "Leo," Marco said, his voice tight with anxiety, "maybe we should just take the money and go. This feels wrong, man. Really wrong." Leo looked at him with disgust. "Wrong? What's wrong is living in a shitty apartment and eating ramen noodles for dinner every night because we're too scared to take what we need. What's wrong is letting opportunity slip away because of some superstitious bullshit. He positioned the crowbar at the base of the crown, looking for the best angle to apply leverage without damaging the gold. Besides, it's not like we're hurting anybody. This is just a piece of stone with some metal attached to it. Tomorrow morning, the priest will file an insurance claim, the church will get paid, and they'll probably buy a cheap replacement. Everybody wins. Marco wanted to argue, wanted to grab Leo and drag him out of the church before they crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, but the words stuck in his throat, and he could only watch as Leo began to work. The first attempt to pry off the crown was unsuccessful. The metal pins holding it to the marble were stronger than Leo had anticipated, and the crowbar slipped, scratching the gold but not loosening the attachment. "Stubborn little thing," Leo muttered, repositioning his tool and trying again. This time he applied more force, using the crowbar like a lever and pushing with his full body weight. The crown shifted slightly, but remained firmly attached. One of the small diamonds popped out of its setting and skittered across the floor, its tiny spark lost in the darkness. "Come on," Leo hissed, frustration growing in his voice. He had imagined this part of the job being much easier. A few quick twists with the crowbar and the valuable items would come free, leaving the statue intact except for some minor scratching. "Leo, someone's going to hear us," Marco warned, glancing nervously toward the rectory. "5 more minutes," Leo replied, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. "This thing has to have a weak point somewhere." He repositioned the crowbar again, this time trying to wedge it between the crown and the statue's forehead. The metal point scraped against the marble, leaving white scratches on the pristine surface. Leo pushed harder, grunting with effort, and felt something give slightly. But instead of the crown coming loose, a piece of the statue's forehead chipped away, falling to the floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the sanctuary like a breaking heart. "Shit," Leo whispered, examining the damage. A small crater now marred Our Lady's face, just above her left eyebrow, exposing rough stone beneath the smooth surface. Marco took a step back, horrified. "Leo, we're destroying it. We need to stop." But Leo was beyond reason now, driven by a combination of greed, frustration, and the criminal's inability to walk away from a job half finished. If he couldn't get the crown off cleanly, he would take it off by force. If the statue got damaged in the process, that was the price of doing business. "I'm not walking away empty-handed," he said, raising the crowbar above his head. "If I can't finesse it off, I'll smash it off." "Leo, don't!" But it was too late. Leo brought the crowbar down with all his strength, aiming for the point where the crown met the statue's head. The metal tool struck the marble face with a sickening crunch, sending fragments of stone flying through the air. But instead of the sound of breaking stone, something else filled the sanctuary, something that made both men freeze in terror. It was music, but not music. A sound like voices singing, but no human voices could make this sound. It was the chorus of every prayer ever whispered, every hymn ever sung, every cry of faith ever lifted toward heaven. It swelled from the broken statue like blood from a wound, filling the church with a sound so beautiful and terrible that it drove both men to their knees. And then came the light, not the harsh glare of electric bulbs or the soft glow of candles, but something alive and pure and infinite. It poured from the cracks in the statue's face like liquid starlight, illuminating the sanctuary with a radiance that made the stained glass windows blaze like jewels. It was the light of creation, the first light that had separated day from night, and it was weeping, because that's what the light was doing. Weeping. Tears of pure luminescence flowed from the statue's damaged eyes, pooling on the floor and spreading outward in ripples of silver fire. Each tear that fell made a sound like crystal bells, like distant thunder, like the heartbreak of a mother watching her children destroy themselves. Leo, still holding the crowbar, felt his entire body begin to shake. The tool fell from his nerveless fingers, clanging on the stone floor as he stared in shock at what he had unleashed. The crack in the statue's face was spreading, spiderwebbing across the marble surface, and from each new fissure came more light, more music, more terrible beauty than any human eyes had ever been meant to see. Marco was sobbing, his face buried in his hands, but he couldn't block out the vision that was forming in the light. A woman's face, more real than reality, more beautiful than any earthly beauty, filled the space above the broken statue. Her eyes were the color of deep ocean water, filled with a sorrow so profound it encompassed every pain that had ever been felt, every loss that had ever been suffered, every mistake that had ever been made. And she was looking directly at them, not with anger, though they deserved anger, not with hatred, though they had earned hatred. She looked at them with the infinite sadness of a mother watching her children hurt themselves, with the bottomless grief of love confronted by willful destruction. In her eyes, Leo saw himself as he really was, not the clever criminal he imagined himself to be, but a broken, frightened man who had spent his entire adult life running from his own emptiness by trying to fill it with things that belonged to other people. He saw every crime he had committed, every person he had hurt, every moment when he had chosen cruelty over kindness, selfishness over sacrifice. Marco saw his grandmother's face in the vision, disappointed, but still loving, still hoping that her grandson would find his way back to the faith she had tried so hard to teach him. He saw every compromise he had made, every moral line he had crossed, every time he had chosen the easy path instead of the right path. The light grew brighter, the music swelled, and both men felt something inside them breaking apart. Not their bodies, but their carefully constructed walls of cynicism and self-justification. The vision of Our Lady didn't speak, didn't need to speak. Her presence was a mirror that reflected not just what they had done, but what they had failed to become. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the phenomenon ended. The light faded. The music stopped. The vision dissolved like morning mist, leaving only two men kneeling on the cold stone floor before a broken statue that somehow still radiated a gentle, forgiving glow from its wounds. The silence that followed was absolute. No sound of traffic from the street outside. No creaking of old wood settling. No whisper of wind through the eaves. Just the sound of two grown men weeping like children, their tears mixing with the scattered money they had stolen and forgotten in the presence of something infinitely more valuable. Leo tried to speak, to explain, to apologize, but no words would come. His throat was raw, though he couldn't remember screaming. His hands shook as he reached towards the broken statue, then pulled back, afraid to touch something so sacred with fingers that had just committed such violence. Marco crawled forward, gathering scattered bills and coins, not to steal them but to return them, to put back what they had taken. His movements were frantic, desperate, as if by undoing the robbery he could somehow undo the desecration. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the statue, to the vision, to the grandmother whose faith he had betrayed. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't understand." Leo, still on his knees, stared at the crowbar that had caused so much damage. It lay on the floor like an accusation, its metal surface somehow tarnished despite having been clean just minutes before. He wanted to pick it up, to hide the evidence of what he had done, but his hands wouldn't obey him. Instead, he found himself speaking to the broken statue as if it were alive, as if the woman in the vision was still listening. "I don't know how to fix this," he said, his voice cracking. "I don't know how to take it back. I don't even know why I did it." But even as he spoke, he realized he did know why. It wasn't really about the money, though he had told himself it was. It wasn't about opportunity or survival or any of the rational reasons he had used to justify the crime. It was about anger. Anger at a world that seemed to offer meaning and purpose to everyone except him. Anger at people who found comfort in faith, while he found only emptiness. Anger at the very idea that there might be something sacred in a universe that had always treated him as disposable. He had attacked the statue because it represented everything he couldn't have, couldn't understand, couldn't be. And in doing so, he had discovered that the sacred was not just real, but more real than anything else he had ever encountered. They stayed there for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes, kneeling before the damaged statue as the gentle glow from its wounds slowly faded. When they finally stood, moving like old men despite their relative youth, the church had returned to normal darkness, illuminated only by streetlight filtering through stained glass. But something fundamental had changed, not just in the building, but in the men themselves. The money scattered on the floor looked like what it was: pieces of paper and metal, temporary things with no lasting value. The crowbar looked like what it was: an instrument of destruction, a tool for taking apart what others had built. They gathered every dollar, every coin, every piece of jewelry they had taken, piling it carefully at the base of the statue like an offering. Leo picked up his crowbar and looked at it for a long moment, then set it down beside the money. He never wanted to see it again. "We have to tell someone," Marco said quietly. "The priest, the police. Someone has to know what happened." Leo nodded, though the idea of confessing terrified him more than any prison sentence. Yeah, we do." They walked out of the church the same way they had entered, through the side door that Leo carefully locked behind them. But they were not the same men who had entered. The greedy, cynical criminals who had broken into St. Michael's were gone, replaced by two broken, humbled souls who had glimpsed something beyond their understanding and been forever changed by it. At their car, Leo paused with his hand on the door handle. "What do we tell them? Who's going to believe us?" Marco looked back at the church, where a faint glow still emanated from the windows of the south transept. "I don't know if they'll believe us, but we have to try." They drove away in silence, each lost in his own thoughts, each trying to process what they had experienced. Neither man would sleep that night. Neither would ever be quite the same again. Father Michael discovered the scene the next morning when he came to unlock the church for daily mass. He found the side door unlocked but undamaged, the sacristy with its broken donation box, and the sanctuary with its shocking centerpiece, the statue of Our Lady of Sorrows, her face cracked and broken, but surrounded by neat piles of money and jewelry that clearly represented more than just the night's theft. At first he thought it was simply a burglary interrupted, perhaps by guilt or fear. But as he knelt before the damaged statue, he noticed something extraordinary. The cracks in the marble seemed to hold light, as if someone had filled them with liquid starlight. When he touched one of the fissures gently, his finger came away glowing with a soft, warm radiance that lasted for several seconds before fading. And there was something else, a lingering sense of presence in the sanctuary, as if the very air still vibrated with the echo of something sacred and profound. Father Michael called the police, as protocol demanded, but when Detective Rodriguez arrived to investigate, they found something that defied easy explanation. The stolen money and jewelry had been returned in full, arranged carefully at the statue's base. The tools used in the break-in had been left behind, as if the thieves had abandoned them voluntarily. There were no fingerprints on anything except the crowbar, and those prints belonged to Leo Torino, a man with a substantial criminal record who had never been known to return stolen goods. Maybe they got spooked, Detective Rodriguez suggested, though he sounded doubtful. Hit the statue, made more noise than they expected, panicked and ran. But Father Michael, studying the impossible beauty of the light-filled cracks in the marble, suspected something else entirely. 2 days later, Leo and Marco walked into the police station together and confessed to the break-in at St. Michael's. They told their story simply and completely, from the planning stages through the moment they had left the church. They didn't expect to be believed about the vision, the light, or the music, and they weren't disappointed. "So you're telling me," Detective Rodriguez said, looking up from his notes, "that you broke into a church, smashed a statue, then had some kind of religious experience that made you return the money and turn yourselves in." "That's exactly what we're telling you," Leo said quietly. Detective Rodriguez looked at the 2 men sitting across from his desk. Leo Torino, career criminal with a rap sheet going back 20 years, sat with his hands folded in his lap like a penitent child. Marco Santini, small-time thief and Leo's usual accomplice, had been crying on and off since they walked into the station. Neither man fit the profile of criminals who voluntarily confessed to crimes the police hadn't even definitively connected to them. "And you expect me to believe that a marble statue started glowing and singing and showed you visions that made you repent your criminal ways?" Leo shrugged. "Believe what you want to believe, Detective. We're telling you what happened. We broke into the church, we stole money, we damaged the statue, and then something else happened. Something that changed us. We're here to take responsibility for what we did and to make whatever restitution we can." The legal proceedings that followed were unusual, to say the least. Leo and Marco pled guilty to breaking and entering, theft and vandalism, but the returned stolen goods and their voluntary confession resulted in relatively light sentences. 2 years for Leo, 18 months for Marco, both with the possibility of early release for good behavior. More importantly, both men insisted on paying for the restoration of the statue, despite having no apparent means to do so. Leo sold his car, his few possessions, and took a job at a construction company, working overtime and donating every extra dollar to the restoration fund. Marco did the same, finding work at a homeless shelter and living on nothing but bare necessities while he saved money for the statue's repair. The restoration itself presented unique challenges. The marble carver brought in to assess the damage, a master craftsman named Giuseppe Benedetti, grandson of the original sculptor, examined the broken statue with confusion and wonder. "I can fix the structural damage," he told Father Michael, "but I've never seen anything like these cracks. They seem to hold light somehow, as if the marble has become translucent. If I fill them with traditional materials, that property will be lost." Father Michael studied the statue, which continued to glow softly in the evenings, drawing visitors from across the city who came to pray and sometimes reported their own experiences of peace, healing, and spiritual renewal. "Then don't fill them," he said finally. "Leave them as they are. Maybe the damage was meant to let the light out, and so the statue of Our Lady of Sorrows was restored, but not erased." Her face was carefully reconstructed, her features returned to their original beauty, but the cracks remained, silver veins of light that made her even more beautiful than before, as if her suffering had been transformed into radiance. The church's financial troubles ended almost immediately. Word of the weeping light Madonna spread through Catholic communities and beyond, drawing pilgrims, tourists, and the simply curious. Donations poured in from around the world, enough not only to repair the building, but to establish an endowment that would ensure St. Michael's survival for generations to come. But the most profound change was in the men who had caused the damage in the first place. Leo Torino, released after serving just 14 months of his sentence, found work as a counselor at a rehabilitation center for ex-convicts. He never spoke publicly about what he had experienced in the church, but those who worked with him noticed a depth and compassion in his approach to helping other criminals turn their lives around that seemed to come from hard-won personal knowledge. Marco Santini completed his sentence and used his savings to open a small restaurant that employed ex-convicts and homeless individuals, giving them a chance to rebuild their lives the way he had rebuilt his own. On the wall behind the cash register hung a small photograph of the restored statue, and Marco was known to say a quiet prayer before opening each morning. Both men remained in Milwaukee, neither wanting to stray too far from the church where their lives had been transformed. They attended Mass at St. Michael's every Sunday, sitting in the back pew, never drawing attention to themselves, but always present, like permanent reminders of the power of redemption. Years passed. Father Michael grew older, eventually retiring and passing the care of St. Michael's to a younger priest who had come specifically to serve at the church with the miraculous statue. The neighborhood around the church began to revive, as businesses and families were drawn by the sense of peace and purpose that seemed to radiate from the sanctuary. And through it all, the statue of Our Lady of Sorrows continued to glow with its gentle inner light, her cracked face more beautiful in its brokenness than it had ever been in its perfection. One evening, 20 years after the break-in, an old man with grey hair and weathered hands knelt before the statue. It was Leo, now in his late 50s, a man who had spent more of his adult life helping others than he had hurting them. He came here every year on the anniversary of that night, not to celebrate what he had done, but to remember what had been done to him, the gift of grace that had shattered his old life and built a new one from the pieces. "Thank you," he whispered to the statue, words he had spoken countless times but never felt were adequate. "Thank you for not giving up on me when I had given up on everything good." As he knelt there in the familiar peace of the sanctuary, Leo thought about the young man he had once been, angry, empty, convinced that the world owed him something, but never sure what. That man had died in this church 20 years ago, not in punishment, but in mercy, not in destruction, but in the kind of love that breaks you open so you can be filled with something better. The light in the statue's cracks seemed to pulse gently, and for just a moment, Leo could swear he saw her again. The woman from the vision, her eyes still filled with that infinite sadness and infinite love. But this time, there was something else in her expression. Approval. Pride. The look a mother gives a child who has finally learned to walk without falling. Leo stayed there until the evening shadows grew long, then rose stiffly and made his way towards the exit. As he reached the door, he passed a young man sitting alone in the last pew, thin, nervous-looking, with the hollow eyes of someone who had lost his way. Leo recognized the look. He had worn it himself once. Without thinking, Leo slid into the pew beside the stranger. "First time here?" he asked quietly. The young man nodded, then shook his head. "I used to come here as a kid. My grandmother brought me. She said this place was special, that Our Lady here could help people who were lost." Leo smiled. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." "She was." The young man's voice cracked slightly. "She died last month. Left me some money. Not much, but enough to get into trouble with. And I've been thinking about doing just that." Leo studied the young man's profile, seeing himself reflected in the desperate set of his shoulders, the way his hands shook slightly as they gripped the back of the pew in front of them. "Can I tell you a story?" Leo asked. The young man looked at him for the first time, taking in Leo's grey hair, his kind but weathered face, the way he seemed completely at peace in this sacred space. "Sure," he said, and so Leo told him. Not everything. Some parts of the story were too sacred, too personal to share with a stranger. But he told him about a man who had once thought that taking what belonged to others could fill the emptiness inside him, about a night when that man had learned the difference between having and being, between possessing and belonging, about the moment when the sacred had reached down and lifted him up, not because he deserved it, but because love doesn't wait for deserving. "What happened to him?" the young man asked when Leo finished. "The man in your story?" Leo smiled. He learned that the treasure he was looking for was never in the things he was trying to steal. It was in the person he could become if he stopped running and started building. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both looking towards the altar where Our Lady of Sorrows stood in her pool of gentle light, her cracked face radiating the beauty that comes only through brokenness transformed. "I don't know how to start over," the young man said finally. "You already have," Leo replied. "The moment you walked through those doors, instead of walking into whatever trouble you were planning, you started over. The rest is just putting one foot in front of the other." Leo reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card, simple white cardstock, with his name and the address of the rehabilitation center where he worked. "If you want to talk more, or if you need help finding work, give me a call. My name's Leo." The young man took the card, his fingers trembling slightly. "Thank you, I'm David." "It's good to meet you, David. And welcome home." Leo stood to leave, then paused and looked back at the statue one more time. In the soft glow emanating from her wounds, he could see the future stretching out, not just his own future, but the endless chain of second chances, of lives transformed, of grace passed from one broken heart to another. The statue that he had once tried to destroy for its gold had become more valuable broken than it had ever been whole. In trying to steal its treasure, he had discovered that the real treasure was never the crown or the rose, but the love that had created it, sustained it, and used even its destruction as an opportunity for redemption. As Leo walked out into the Milwaukee night, past the revitalized neighborhood that had grown up around the church, past the small businesses and family homes that had been drawn by the sense of peace emanating from the sanctuary, he felt the familiar weight of gratitude settle over his shoulders like a comfortable coat. Tomorrow, he would return to his work at the rehabilitation center, helping other ex-convicts find their way back to useful lives. Tomorrow, he would continue building the life that had been given to him as a gift 20 years ago. Tomorrow, he would wake up as a man who had learned that the most beautiful things in life are often the ones that have been broken and rebuilt with love. But tonight, he simply walked home through streets that no longer felt dangerous or hostile, past windows glowing with warm family light, under stars that seemed to shine with the same gentle radiance that filled the cracks in Our Lady's face. Behind him, St. Michael the Archangel stood watch over the neighborhood, its spires pointing toward heaven, its heart housing a statue that proved every day that destruction and creation, brokenness and beauty, sin and redemption are often just different words for the same miraculous process. And in the sanctuary, where the light never completely faded, Our Lady of Sorrows continued her eternal vigil, arms outstretched in welcome, eyes lowered in compassion, heart open to receive the prayers of all who had lost their way and found it again in the place where love had transformed even violence into grace. The two men who had once entered that sacred space as thieves had learned the most important lesson of all, that the divine doesn't punish those who break what is holy. Instead, it waits patiently for them to understand that they themselves are what was meant to be made whole. In the end, the greatest miracle wasn't the vision of Our Lady, or the light that poured from her wounds, or even the transformation of two hardened criminals into men of compassion and service. The greatest miracle was the truth that had been there all along, waiting to be discovered by anyone willing to kneel in honest surrender, that love is stronger than greed, that grace is more powerful than guilt, and that the God who allows sacred things to be broken is the same God who specializes in making broken things more beautiful than they ever were before.